the public sector. They are tipped to help Kenya achieve a 6% economic growth this year. Security is among the sectors that will receive the highest amount of allocation. Key priorities include continuity in the lease financing for police vehicles and aircrafts, which is set to receive at least 8.2 billion shillings. Another 13.2 billion shillings has been earmarked for enhancing security operations and 15.6 billion shillings for military modernization, among others. Official figures show that 12.2 billion shillings is set to be allocated to ongoing irrigation projects such as Galana Kulalu and Mwea irrigation schemes and transforming the agriculture sector. 4.9 billion shillings has been allocated for fertilizer and seed subsidy program. To help farmers access markets and open up counties, 30 billion shillings has been allocated for low-volume seal roads. These are among measures that are expected to help in commercializing agriculture and enhance food security. On energy, 6 billion shillings is set to be allocated for power transmission, 5.1 billion shillings for rural electrification program, 3.1 billion shillings for ongoing street lighting program, and 1.8 billion shillings for electricity connection subsidy. On to the education sector, 32 billion shillings is set to be allocated for the free day secondary education and 14 billion shillings for the free primary education program. 13.4 billion shillings has been earmarked for the school laptop project. In the health sector, 4.3 billion shillings is for free maternal health care and 4.5 billion shillings has been earmarked for leasing of medical equipment.
Thank you, Ronald Owili, for that report. Of course, that is a report that was prepared by Ronald Owili, where the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary, Henry Rotich, is expected to table in Parliament 2.3 trillion shillings budget for the year 2016-2017 financial year this afternoon. Today's budget, of course, is expected to prioritize security, infrastructure, agriculture, healthcare, devolution, and reforming the public sector, as Roncliffe, that is Ronald Owili, did indicate there. And in the studio with us to try and put some of these things into context is none other than Michael Mburugu. He's a partner at PKF Kenya and as well a member of the tax committee at the Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Welcome, Michael, to the program.
Thank you, Martin.
PKF Kenya, if you may just let us know what it means, the acronym PKF, so that we begin on a clean slate.
Thanks, Martin. PKF Kenya is an international audit firm, meaning Panel Car Foster, but we no longer use those names, so shortly we are known as PKF. Shortly. We exist in about 122 countries globally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. At least we now know by now, so that when I say PKF Kenya, somebody understands certified public accountant, but what do you do and all that. Right. 2.3 trillion shillings budget is what we expect the Treasury CS to present this afternoon. And one will ask the first question that where do we get the financing of this?
Well, the financing, Martin, comes in two ways, and the big chunk of financing is obviously the taxpayer kitty. About 1.3 trillion shilling is expected to be from the Kenya Revenue Authority, which is the taxpayers' money. The rest of financing usually will come in various forms in what you call appropriations in end, and obviously government borrowing. It may be external borrowing or borrowing locally to finance the deficit. And usually the government does borrow locally through treasury bills, treasury bonds, and many other forms of concessional loans. And externally as well, for example, the Eurobond is a good example of how the government is able to tap into money out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Controversial as it may have. But then the question will be, the 2015-2016 budget was about 2.1 trillion shillings.
Right.
We're talking about 2.3 now. One will ask, why do we keep expanding the budget instead of maybe contracting or just reducing so that we have, say, 1.5 trillion?
Interesting, Martin. But remember that we are a developing country. Taking you back in the year 2002, when the former President Moi left power, our budget was about 220 billion. We have now grown to 2.3 trillion, right? And obviously, I am sure you are able to visualize and you are able to see the difference between 2002 and today in terms of the infrastructure, the realms, the security systems, and many other things that the government has put in place. So it's very typical of a developing country that the budget is always going to be expansionary. It's unlikely that that budget is going to come down anytime soon, for as long as this is a developing country. Remember, we do not have even perhaps what I may say even a quarter of the infrastructure that we would like to see in this country. We do not have the facilities for, education and many other things. The farmers, we have not even started to add value to our farming outputs. There is a lot that the government needs to put in place, and therefore, for as long as we are in this change where we are putting up a lot of infrastructure, the budget is always going to expand, and that is very typical of a developing country.
But then one will ask the question that as we talk about 2.3 trillion shillings budget, Wanjiku is likely to suffer, because you did indicate something about local borrowing, and there are fears especially that it's the common mwananchi, it's the Kenyan worker that's going to be taxed, overtaxed as it were, so that we finance this budget. How is that statement?
Well, not necessarily. Looking at the budget estimates that have been tabled by the CS Treasury, I think there are ambitious plans in terms of how to raise the financing to meet the budget. And one of the things that the government may not have tapped very well in the past is the PPP, the public partnerships. This is one of the sources of financing to meet the infrastructure financing that I expect the government is likely to deploy. The other one is that, Martin, you need to take into account the fact that perhaps the tax compliance rate in this country is about 45%, not even 50%. Therefore, there is a whole lot of people out there who do not meet their tax expectation in terms of compliance. And mainly these are people in the informal sector. So you've seen what the Kenya Revenue Authority is doing in terms of the reforms to make it easy for people to pay their taxes, to recruit the landlords, the people who are earning rental income to the tax net. Those are people who traditionally have not been complying with their tax requirements.
And what has been stopping them from paying those taxes? Because as far as I know, we have laws in this country.
Yes.
So that you can pay taxes.
Yeah. Interesting. Obviously, they were never exempted from paying taxes. But the reality of the matter, as I said, Martin, you remember back in 2002, we were all just about meeting a budget of 220 billion shillings. There have been significant reforms over time, and the Kenya Revenue Authority today is collecting about 1.2 to 1.23 trillion shillings. There has been reforms, and I can tell you in any environment, the tax compliance is always best when it is self-declaration. So there are initiatives, obviously, by the Kenya Revenue Authority. You remember the last financial year, the government gave an amnesty on rental income to encourage people to come out and voluntarily declare their taxes. So these reforms inevitably have to be put in place to help, bridge the gap in terms of tax compliance. And I agree with you that, yes, the laws have been in place, but you cannot hold to the past so much. The country has to move forward. And I think the best thing, in fact, the government needs to do now is to open up the tax amnesty that they gave last year for only rental income, to expand it to all other facets of income, including a lot of money that is stashed out there. You saw the Panama leaks. Yes, and there are many Kenyans, obviously, we cannot bury our hands in the sand, who have been named in that report as holding, huge sums of money in Panama and very many other, islands out over there, many other countries. I think it is time for government to consider giving, a complete amnesty for such people to repatriate those, that money without having to face either criminal sanctions or any tax sanctions. Or the government could even impose some literal taxes for any money that is repatriated. That is going to help in two ways. It's going to help in meeting our forex position. It's going to help in terms of getting these people to the tax net. And this has been tested elsewhere. It happened in India. It happened in Malaysia. And they were able to net in quite a significant amount of money repatriated to their countries.
But then the question will be, are we going so much in terms of thinking outside the bracket, yes, we agree, in terms of the tax that we want to have in this country and the amount we want to have. But those who argue that as we talk about local borrowing, external borrowing, and all those kind of things that we're talking about here, now targeting rental income, for example, that those who say that we seem to lose so much money, we have so many loopholes through which we lose a lot of money that could have been used for development purposes as opposed to recurrent, for example.
Yeah.
And an example will be corruption. How much do we lose? And maybe if we did that, we're not going to think so much about external borrowing.
Yeah, well, Martin, it's true that we have to think out of the box in terms of not only raising our revenues, but also in terms of controlling our expenditure. I do agree with you that it's not in doubt that corruption is very costly to us. You would say the cost of corruption, which is not quantified by anyone, I would put it at my estimate at least 50% of the expenditure in this country is lost to corruption, or we don't get value for money. You have seen the rampant corruption within the county government, for example. That coupled with that in the national government is almost a crisis. You've seen county governments procure simple things that would cost 5,000 shillings for over 100,000 shillings. That is the cost of corruption. A wheelbarrow would normally go for about 5,000 shillings. If you bought it for 100,000, so you're saying it's bought at 95,000 more. That is a good example of the cost of corruption. So indeed, there is no doubt that the government needs to put in place stricter sanctions, measures to deal with this issue. It's a big issue, Martin, and every Kenyan, wherever you are, you've got to play your part in dealing with the issue of corruption. But most importantly, I think there are some reforms that the government has put in place in terms of trying to privatize some of the government functions. Most of the big infrastructure today is under the PPP program, and that is going to, typically the private sector operates very efficiently, and it's one of the easy ways of dealing with corruption, to privatize some of the government functions.
And I want to talk about external borrowing, because you did cite Eurobond, for example, as a source of external borrowing, if I got you well.
Right.
But the question will be, recently there was an argument that if you look at this country, we have borrowed so much externally that even the unborn owes the external financing institutions, for example, a lot of money. In fact, it was being estimated 79,000.
Well, Martin, I think I hold a different opinion in terms of borrowing. Our borrowing to the GDP percent is about 41% at the moment. If you look today at the world debt clock, you will see countries like Japan are in excess of 200% of borrowing to the GDP. Most countries in Europe as well, America as well. So I do not think that we've reached a level that is alarming in terms of borrowing. The big question to me is how we put into use the money that we borrow. And every single business, you can parallel the government to the private sector. I can tell you most of the thriving businesses in town, you have to borrow. That's how the banks make their money. That is how corporations grow. We are at a stage where we are as a developing country. Tax revenues will not be enough, because then you would have to take that money from the taxpayers. It means you overtax the people. That's not going to yield the results. And I do not think that we've reached a level that is marked as alarming for a developing country by the World Bank. And I think at 41% to the GDP, I don't think that we are doing anything wrong at all. What I think needs to be prioritized is where to put the money. We cannot borrow money externally to put it to recurrent expenditure, for example. So I would expect what the government is supposed to be doing is to have some austerity measures. In terms of the wage bill for the civil service, it's standing today at about 1.5 trillion, budgeted at 1.5 trillion, up from 1.3 trillion last year. You can see a huge chunk of our money is going to financing salaries and wastage in government.
And so what can we do to reverse that? Because we talk about recurrent expenditure, salaries and all those kind of, do we see?
Ideally, there are two things that in my mind ought to happen immediately. And one of them has already started. The Salaries and Remuneration Commission obviously is trying to harmonize the government functions in terms of the labor force, remuneration, and the number of people in any government. For example, I'll give you a very good example. A middle-level, officer in government enjoys a massive office, sitting on space that otherwise should be rented out or could be rented out. He has a secretary, he has a copy typist, maybe he has a driver and a bodyguard, and some 2 vehicles are allocated to him. That is total wastage. I do not have a driver myself. I do not have a secretary myself. We are at a time when we need to make our systems efficient. And I think that's what the government needs to do. That is what the Salaries and Remuneration Commission ought to be doing, to review the usefulness of some of the functions or people existing in our government today. Because 1.5 trillion sharing is going to paying salaries. That is not necessary. But having said so...
You almost sound like you are propagating for retrenchment of some sort.
Ideally, that is what I'm saying in other terms. But again, you have to look at...
At the same time, we need to create employment.
Definitely, but employment should not be created in government. Far from the truth. The government cannot be the person to create employment. What the government needs to do is to put an environment where the private sector is going to thrive, where private small businesses are going to thrive, and people are going to create this employment for themselves. You want to create an environment where the farmers can do value add to their crops, and that way you're going to create, there's going to be a multiplier effect in terms of creating employment. In fact, it's not possible that people today, if I got a graduate from any of our universities today, I don't think any one of them wants to work in government, for a fact. But having said so, there are other areas of government that are understaffed. Our police force. You know, ideally with our population, we would be expecting to have a police force of about 100,000. We are at about 65,000 today. So there are areas of government that obviously will need some staffing, like the police force, to make sure that we have the security, which is important for the businesses to thrive and the country as well.
And that explains why security is getting a huge chunk of money out of the 2.3 trillion.
Definitely, and if you look at the last 2 years, over 15,000 police officers have been recruited. So I think it's in the right direction, but a lot needs to be done in the mainstay civil service. I think there's a retrenchment that is bound to happen, and that is inevitable. We cannot be spending close to 60% of our resources to paying salaries.
But then somebody will ask that if we talk about public service, I don't know whether you're also considering the kind of positions we have, talk about parliamentarians, that those who argue that bloated political representation, does also that have to blame for the current situation we are in?
Martin, remember also the complexity of the 47 county governments. Do we need 47 county governments? All those county governments got to be staffed. You need resources. You need infrastructure. That is going to take more. In fact, you would expect in the next few years, if we do not do something to reverse that situation, then we are going to spend a lot more in terms of employing staff for the county governments and the mainstay government as well. So I think ideally as a country, it is also time to rethink whether the structure of our government is the right one, because you have 47 governments that require financing, that require to employ staff, and many other things. So I think ideally it's a question for every Kenyan to ask themselves. For example, do we need almost 400 members of parliament? Who are they representing and what are they doing? Do we need close to 3,000 MCAs? Do we need 47 governors? Do we need 47 senators and the nominated ones? Those are all the questions that we have to ask ourselves. So in as much as we put pressure to the government of the day to cut on the wage bill, then we have to ask ourselves as Kenyans, did we make certain mistakes in 2010 when we passed the new constitution? Did we create a structure that is inevitably going to take all the money into recurrent expenditure?
But there are those who argue that if you look at the statistics, critically speaking, especially when it comes to political representation, that the amount that goes to salaries of members of parliament, senators, is only about 1.1% of the national budget. So why should there be a hullabaloo regarding that particular amount when it's just 1.1% of the national budget?
Remember one thing, that if you advance that kind of argument, everybody at whatever level of facet of government they serve will extend the same argument. And, 1.1% here and another 1.1% in the civil service to our teachers, to the police force, will give room to the bloated budget that I'm talking about. So the question is, do you need 400 members of parliament in the country the size of Kenya with only 40 million people to legislate?
That's a fair question. But then when you look at the entire question of the amount being allocated to various sectors, talk about agriculture, talk about energy, talk about devolution, talk about infrastructure. So far, are you contented with the manner the government wants to handle this, just looking at the pre-budget analysis?
Well, I think looking at the budget estimates that have been tabled, in the circumstances, the government has tried its very best. Because one, the split between financing infrastructure projects. Remember, the standard gauge rail is ongoing. The 10,000 kilometer annuity program has been suspended for some time. The government has intentions to revamp that. So I think in terms of allocation, and faced with the reality that first the government got to meet the salaries, I think that they are trying and they are doing the best. But there's one facet that perhaps has not been handled by government very well, and is the rollout or implementation or full-scale implementation of the PPPs. That needs to happen as soon as possible. I think the legal framework that exists and the PPP Secretariat are not doing a good job in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. Remember, foreign direct investment would be a very good replacement of government or taxpayer money to finance the infrastructure projects. It takes probably about 9 months to 12 months to go through shortlisting of transactional advisors for PPP projects. It would then take another 12 months to go through a procurement process to identify suitable PPP partners. That's about 24 months. It's not reasonable. In my view, the government definitely needs to do something about the legal framework around the PPPs. It will make it easier to attract FDI, make it easier for people to come and put their money here. Additionally as well, the government needs to put in place certain tax measures to attract foreign investors. If you look, for example, at our Income Tax Act of 1974, a very old one for that matter, imposes certain taxes on foreign money, things like taxes known as deemed capitalization, deemed interests, and compensating taxes. Those are all taxes that are being levied to a foreigner who brings their money to invest in Kenya. Far from the truth, what the government ought to be doing is actually to remove all those taxes, to attract them to put the monies here, to make the private sector to thrive. And these are some of the realities that the government ought to face.
You know, I almost wanted to ask you to explain the type of taxes that you've referred to, but I want to believe we should be doing this at night when you come over for post-analysis. But then as we bring this to an end, because I'm told we'll have a lot of time, by the way, during Channel 1 News Hour, so no harm. What should we look forward to as we expect the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary to come and present the 2016-2017 budget today?
Yeah, I would be looking at a situation where the CS is going to lay out its framework or its policies to contain the macroeconomic environment that is suitable for the businesses to thrive. One of the things that I would be looking at is to control the inflation rate to below 5%, or to try and achieve at least below 5% or keep it at the current level. I would like to see measures implemented to lower the cost of borrowing. Remember, today you are paying interest rates of about 20% to 24%. It's extremely high for businesses. And I think that, whereas the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank is doing something to contain, the government got to do more by not borrowing locally. They should consider borrowing externally so that they do not put pressure on, available credit locally for businesses. That's going to lower the interest rates. So those are some of the things that I would expect. And obviously, we would like to see financing and, of new infrastructure projects. The 10,000 kilometer annuity program, got to be given priority, because it's with these huge infrastructure projects that the country is going to grow. So I would be looking at short-term measures that will create an environment, a good macroeconomic environment for businesses to thrive, and also plans to fund the infrastructure projects, the extension of the SGR project from Nairobi to Western, and also implementation of the other upset projects, the Ram Port, the zero resort cities, and all the upset projects as envisioned under Vision 2030 is something we would like to see the CS implement.
And articulate. Thank you very much for getting time to be with us. I want to believe that it's a conversation that we're going to have, especially during Channel 1 News Hour, because the budget is here with us. It will be read by National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich this afternoon. And Mr. Mburugo, looking forward to seeing you during that particular time for some deeper analysis when we have the figures and especially the allocations with us. It's at this point that we bring this to an end, and remember, Simon Njoroge is coming up with part 3 of the interview, and we want to look at matters children. Tomorrow is the day of the African child, and we expect in studio the Principal Secretary that has been very vocal in terms of dealing with issues to do with children, and that is Susan Mochache. Hope she's in the house. So Samuel Njoroge coming up with that interview. My name is Martin Mwanje. Stay tuned to the program Good Morning Kenya, because this is the only way to kickstart your morning.